Today I'm going to show you how to build color shifting Mustang taillights,
Specifically S550 taillights with the clear lenses.
and yes, it does have to be the clear lens. If you use red lenses, you will not be able to see the color change in the lights.
As always, let's start with the tools that we're going to need.
Step one is obviously a clear lens set of taillights. I'll have that link below. These lights are permasealed with some of the toughest permaseal I have ever seen. Also, this trough is massive. You are never going to be able to bake that open. So these will have to be cut open. The cutter that we use is an ultrasonic cutter, specifically the one that plugs in. Look at the blade size on this. It is very, very thin. So the cut on it is going to be very thin.
But that's a $500 tool. And if you don't want to buy a $500 tool,
You could just use a Dremel with a diamond bit. These diamond bits are pretty thin. This is an extremely messy method, so we try not to do that. Next up is various screwdrivers. So I've got two flatheads here, one pocket and one regular size flathead. These are going to be used to crack the back housing off of the front housing after we cut it. And a Phillips head screwdriver. There are 7 Phillips head screws inside and on the outside of these taillights. Once the lights are open, you are going to need some LEDs. These are some 12-volt addressable LEDs that we use. To control them, we are going to use a blue ghost module, and we're going to use various types of wire to actually wire the module to the LEDs that are inside the taillights. Red and black are for power and ground, and this is just some connected LED wire to make it a little bit easier. And of course, we are going to loom the whole thing to make it look really nice and pretty.
there are several great options when it comes to addressable LEDs. These specifically are the automotive custom lighting LEDs. But Next Level Neo is another amazing option. They're going to have many different styles of LED strips and chips that you can pick from, and all of them are great. This is the kind that we've been using for several years now, and we have not had any issues with them. Also, I really like the spacing on this.
I prefer the slightly more spaced out chips compared to the ones that are closer together. To me, it just feels like it flows a little bit more natural when it's actually installed in the light. To wire up those LEDs and those wires, we are going to need some solder and some soldering irons, some wire snips, and a wire crimping tool, because for the power and ground, we're gonna have to put an eyelet on that Blue Ghost module over there. Once everything has been completely built out, it is time to seal it back up, starting with a plastic welder. This is how we are going to give it the structure and make sure that it is mostly watertight.
It won't be waterproof until you silicone it with some black silicone.
Which of course is our next tool. Some black silicone and of course a caulking gun. Now that we know what tools we're gonna need, let's go ahead and get started. I am going to draw the cut line just so that you can see where we're gonna cut. I don't normally draw the cut line out on every single build. There we go. Now you can see exactly where we're gonna cut. You may have noticed that most of it is just cutting right along this edge here. All we're trying to do is get this back housing off so that the inner housing can slip right out.
One important thing to know before you start cutting into this and before you start prying on it after the cut is that the inner housing is bolted to the back housing from the front.
Meaning when you take this off, the inner housing is gonna come right with it. And I keep doing this motion because we're gonna go that direction instead of that direction. So let's get our ultrasonic cutter and start cutting. Now that we have this cut all the way around, I'm going to start on this side that has no fins on it by just sticking my flathead screwdriver right in the little crack. And there we go. The lens is completely off. Here's the screws that you're gonna have to take off. Right here in front of you, you can see all 6 that you need to take out. And if we flip it over, right over here is 1 more. So that is 7 total that we need to take out before the inner housing can actually come off.
I've literally opened dozens of these, and almost every time there's a different configuration of how they set these LEDs up on the inside. Most of the time, there's some sort of connector in here. Sometimes it's on these circuit boards. Sometimes it's on this circuit board. Sometimes it's one big connector where all the wires run in and then they separate out. And this time, for whatever reason, there are no connectors whatsoever. Sometimes the big circuit board is on one of these little light modules right here. I have no idea why they're all different. I've even ordered them in bulk before, and in the bulk order, they'll be different. So your set might look completely different than what I have right here. That's okay. This still works. In our case, since there's no connectors, I'm not going to disconnect anything. Definitely not going to be cutting wires. I am just going to unbolt them right here so that we can put our LEDs in, and we're gonna put it right back. The way that I do this to make sure that I get these installed in the exact right position is I try to just do one at a time, even whenever you can disconnect them, so that you can take this off, do what you need to do, reinstall it back, and do the next one the same way. Speaking of what we need to do, so this is going to be the first one. It's very important to remember which one is the bottom and which one is the top when you're looking at this, because it's pretty easy to get confused. This is just a straight line, but we need it to go a specific direction. These lights naturally sit like this, as you can see over here. So what I like to do is have it go in that direction, the up direction, up and to the right. We're going to install this LED strip right inside this little housing, sitting just on the other side of the OEM red LED. Yes, I like to leave the red LEDs in there. I try to leave those alone because that is going to help significantly with your turn signal and your brake lights. Personally, I don't feel like a lot of addressables are quite bright enough for your brake lights and your tail lights just yet, especially when you're going through a diffuser like we're trying to do here. So we can have our fun, have the illegal LEDs in there, but make sure that you keep your red LEDs in place. But we'll mod the parking light so that the addressables run the parking light. These are plenty bright for that. These strips are going to have 3 wires coming in and coming out so that we can get power, data, ground running into the strip, and we can send the power, data, ground out to the other 2 strips. But to make that fit, we're going to have to slightly modify this housing. We're going to do a slight cut on the bottom and a slight cut on the top so that the wires have a spot to go in and out. And there we go. So now we have the wires going into the LEDs installed, and the LEDs going out. This strip here is going to wrap around and tap into here. So we can probably go ahead and bolt this one up where it needs to be and get it permanently set. Okay, that first joule is actually bolted down, and if you notice, I made this wire a little bit long. I do that on purpose so that we can run it out of this back housing and through this grommet right here. That's the goal, is to go through the back housing and through this grommet. The module needs to be connected inside the vehicle, and you have to get the wires through the grommet to be inside the vehicle. One way that we make this a little bit more efficient is by wiring up the LED strips before we even open up the lights. So we know that each of these joules is going to be 9 chips for this exact strip. So we count out 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. And then we go ahead and have our wire cut out. So I'm gonna cut another piece of wire about this long. I'm going to wire this output into this strip, making sure that the direction of the arrows is headed the right direction. We're gonna do another wire right here with one more strip. That one doesn't need an output wire because it's the very end. Then our wiring totally done. It doesn't take as long as doing one whole joule at a time. After that, we can go ahead and pre-cut each of these. Then after that, we can set the strips. It just makes it a little more efficient if you batch out the work. So let's get on that right about now.
There we go. These are looking really good so far. So before we actually install this inner housing back into the back housing, I like to test. Of course, I try to test everything as much as possible. These are testing out great. So the very next thing that we actually need to do is to drill a hole back here so that we can feed our input wire through the back. The way that I like to feed the wire through the back is using one of these grommets. You can buy a little kit like this from Amazon or eBay or anywhere on the internet. It's just little rubber grommets. They're universal, so you just make a little slice with a screwdriver or some scissors. This already has a slice in it, actually. We're going to drill a hole in this back housing using a little Christmas tree bit, a little step down bit, whatever you want to call it. We're going to drill a hole and then feed the grommet in and then put the wires through the grommet. I try to go near the other grommet. It doesn't super matter. Like this right here is where I'm gonna put it. That just seems like a good spot because everywhere else is kind of folded and not super flat. Got the inner housing fully installed where it needs to be. The wiring is coming out the back, and we have already dusted the inside of the lens and the inside of the housing. So it is time to set the inner housing and the back housing back in place. To do so, we're just going to do the exact opposite of what we did to take it out. So what we did was just put it back on in that general direction. With the back housing back on, it is time to plastic weld our cut line. So literally all that we're going to do is melt the two halves back together all the way around the light. Once we have plastic welded it, it is time to put the silicone on. So let's go ahead and get started. There we go. This light is completely plastic welded and sealed up, and you can tell that we went ahead and fed our power data ground wire through the main grommet. While that's curing, we're going to build out the other side, and we are going to build out the Blue Ghost harness. I'm going to go ahead and cut in some footage of us building out the Blue Ghost harness, but if you want the full in-depth on how to do it, I will have that video linked somewhere. So starting from right to left, we have power in, ground, 12 volt power for the relays, then input 1, input 2, input 3, input 4, which is brake, park, left, right. Those other 4 inputs are if you have the Blue Ghost Plus and want to have the extra relays so you can have other accessories go from a Bluetooth controller on your phone. In this case, we're using a light just because we don't need all these extra relays. Down here we have all the outputs. This is ground, data, voltage, ground, data, voltage. So you can use the connectors that the module came with right off of the module for the outputs, but you'll still have to find another connector and wire it out to the taillight. Instead, I like to use the big wire roll and go right off of the module and go all the way out to the taillight and then do my connectors at the taillight. In my experience, it's easier for the customer to install the taillights on the car without having all this extra wire hanging out of the back. Before you cut any of the wires, you're gonna wanna figure out where you want to place the module inside the car, because it could be different if you're gonna set it in the engine bay versus in the trunk. In this case, we're gonna wire it up for a trunk setup. Okay, I've determined that I need about this much wire on either side, so I'm gonna get 2 more of these. Okay, all the wires are cut. Now we can start adding it to the Blue Ghost module. I'm gonna start with the output. I stripped just a little bit off so that it's enough to go in, but not enough to have excess wire hanging out of the screw connectors. This is why you need a really small screwdriver, because the screw terminals are extremely small. With we've got all of our inputs wired in, and we have our outputs wired in for the right and left light. Now we can do the power and ground. So the way I figure out how much power wire I need is a little ridiculous. I kind of just gauge it from the outside of the car. I'll just show you. Okay, we need about that much. And we have the power and ground wire. You could go ahead and put this directly on the module, but I like to add the converter right here next to the module. Always remember heat shrink. Okay, we've got the converter on there and the power wires on there. And I know that this looks like a total mess, but once I put the loom on it, it's going to clean up really nicely. And again, the converter is only because I'm using 5-volt addressables and not 12. This is pretty much completely wired up. The only things we'll have to do now are add some loom and some connectors. There's a few options when it comes to connectors. JSTs is an option. The only problem with that is that they are not waterproof, so a lot of people don't like to use it for headlights. I'll still use them for taillights here and there, but a lot of people want to use the waterproof ones that screw on. So really, it's up to you what you want to use. Of course, before we do the connectors, you have to do loom, otherwise you won't be able to get the connector on there. Okay, and now you can tell just how much better this looks with the loom versus without. So you're gonna wanna do connectors out of the back of the headlight on both sides. Then I like to split it side to side and have connectors there. So I'm gonna go ahead and show you what mine looks like. So here's the Blue Ghost module, and it is potted with potting epoxy. This is your power and ground coming all the way out. It is quite long because this is a tail light module. So I've got power that's fused, ground, and it goes into a 12-volt to 5-volt converter. Then we've got one side connector that has everything you need for RGB and turn signal. And the other side, same thing, RGB, turn signal, and parking lights. One thing I like to do is design it so that they only plug in one way. You can't cross the connectors from side to side. That way your turn signal is always gonna work the right way. It just makes it easier for the customer. If you're wiring it up for yourself, you probably know what it's gonna be, so it's not that big of a deal. But if you wanna make it easier for yourself and for anyone else who may have those lights, I suggest trying to make the harness different from side to side so that it's easier for everyone. They know which way it's gonna go. This Ghost module is completely built out for these taillights, and I have completed both sides. Let me go ahead and show you. These are all done. As you can see, we left the plastic wrap that was already on these from the manufacturer. I tried to do that so the customer is the one that gets to take it off. That leaves the lenses nice and fresh. Then there's less chance of us putting any micro scratches on it or any fingerprints, which is great. So we're gonna get these boxed up and shipped out to the customer.